Hi guys. So today's lecture is one of the important ones. Past के अंदर they have had plenty of essays which talks about comparing between the different countries and country का in itself the living standards. तो फिर this is where we start off basically development. How do you classify economies? कि वो कौन से डेवलपमेंट स्टेज के ऊपर हैं एंड ऑब्वियसली नेशनल इनकम इज वन ऑफ द मेजर एलिमेंट्स which we use to identify those, right? You must have heard the term develop and developing. Back in the day, we also used to call underdeveloped, least developed economies. But nowadays, what we say is that all economies are developing and they're seeking to become developed, all right? So this is our main idea here. Now we know कि जो developed economies होती हैं like you can say USA हो गया UK हो गया Scandinavian economies हो गई. We know that people over there are earning high incomes. Their markets are much more mature, whether we're talking about like financial institutions and the banking institutions, state bank, um, कोई भी आपकी मार्केट्स हो गई जैसे लोकल इंटरनेशनल नेशनल मार्केट्स हैं where goods are being bought and sold, they're much more mature in terms of the technology and the buying and the selling and productivities and all of that. So this is what we're saying. Obviously, those countries have high living standards and they have high levels of productivity. Now, it could be because their people are much more educated, or maybe they have those advanced technologies which allow every individual to be able to produce much more. In contrast, obviously, we know जो developing economies होती हैं, उनका जो GDP per head होता है, that is on the lower side. They are relying on much fewer, a lot fewer goods, and ज़्यादातर primary sector के ऊपर उनका focus होता है. Labor productivity is not that high as well. राइट सो इसको ऑब्वियसली हम कंपेयर करते हैं डेवलप्ड इकोनॉमी के साथ. तो प्लीज मेक श्योर इफ यू डूइंग योर ऐसे मेक कंपैरिजन ऑन बोथ साइड, जस्ट डोंट लीव इट ऑन वन साइड कि लो इनकम में ऐसा होता है तो ऑब्वियसली हाई के अंदर इट इज गिवन. मेक श्योर दैट यू राइट बोथ साइड, इट विल एड अप टू योर पॉइंट्स. तो उसी तरह से जो मार्केट्स हैं, जो इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, वो वेल डेवलप्ड होती हैं, अच्छा इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर होता है. Tertiary sector is much more on the higher side. The banking and the insurance and the shipping, supply chain side, all of these are much more stronger, right? So let's go back, go into the details. किस तरीके से इकोनॉमीज के अंदर हम इनको फिर फर्दर क्लासिफिकेशन देते हैं. So let's talk about that. फिर आपके पास आता है कंट्रीज. ऑब्वियसली जो वर्ल्ड बैंक है वो तो जीएनआई को देखता है. इन द बिगनिंग व्हेन वी वर डीलिंग विद मैक्रो, वी स्पोक अबाउट कि जीडीपी पर हेड क्या होता है. जीडीपी पर हेड इज बेसिकली जो भी मुल्क में आउटपुट प्रोड्यूस हुआ है उसको आप डिवाइड कर लें विद पॉपुलेशन. तो इट्स बेसिकली इनकम पर हेड प्रोड्यूस्ड इन द इकोनॉमी. जो जीएनआई पर कैपिटा होता है, दैट इज अबाउट द कंट्रीज रिसोर्सेज इररिस्पेक्टिव ऑफ द बाउंड्री. तो आपके जो रिसोर्सेज मुल्क से बाहर हैं और वो बाहर मुल्क में ऑपरेट हो रहे हैं, तो बिकॉज वो पाकिस्तानी रिसोर्स है तो हम उसको जीएनआई में कंसिडर करेंगे. लेकिन जो बाहर वालों का रिसोर्स पाकिस्तान के अंदर इन्वॉल्व है, हमने उसको माइनस भी करना है. राइट, सो इट इज अ मच बेटर एंड अ ट्रूअर पिक्चर इट गिव्स. फिर उससे भी ज्यादा बेहतर जो है वो एनएनआई है, पर इसमें डेप्रिसिएशन कम्स इनटू अकाउंट एंड रेयरली बिजनेसेस बेसिकली यूज दिस, राइट. फिर आप आ जाते हैं कि हम बेसिकली अब जो नॉर्मली वर्ल्ड बैंक के हिसाब से यूज होता है, हम कंट्रीज को चार तरीकों से ब्रेक डाउन करते हैं. यू हैव द लो इनकम कंट्रीज, you have the low middle income countries, you have the high, upper middle income countries, and then you have the high income economies. इससे क्या होता है कि इससे हमारे लिए बड़ा इजी हो जाता है टू आइडेंटिफाई. इवन फॉर वर्ल्ड बैंक इट बिकम्स वेरी क्लियर कि अच्छा जी, हु आर द कंट्रीज व्हिच इज गोइंग टू बी प्रोवाइडिंग एड and which are the countries who are going to be needing the aid. Same goes even with the loan वाली situation कि कौन सी countries को loans की जरूरत होंगी और कौन सी countries are likely to be giving out loans. So if you look at the threshold below, this is how we're breaking it down. I'll convert it into rupees, Pakistani rupees, so that it makes more sense to you. So in Pakistan, if in a country, uh, लो इनकम इकोनॉमीज वो होती हैं जो $1,025 पर एनम कमाते हैं, तो इन रुपये के टर्म्स के अंदर दिस इज समवेयर अराउंड, इफ every individual in your economy is earning somewhere around 24,000 rupees per month. मैंने इसको रुपये में कन्वर्ट कर दिया है, राइट? 24,000 रुपीज पर पर्सन अगर आपकी इकोनॉमी में लोग कमा रहे हैं, तो ये आप लो इनकम इकोनॉमीज में कंसिडर होते हैं. Afghanistan and troubled economies usually come under this. Okay, this is per month salary per person. Lower middle income is again 24,000 up to almost close to 4,000. So that's ranging to almost $93,000. ये मैं निकाल रहा हूँ on the current dollar exchange rate, which is of 280 rupees is equal to $1, right? So if you're making somewhere around 93,000 per person in your economy, people are earning that. It's a reasonable salary, right? But that's close to 4,000. Okay, Pakistan is somewhere around 1,900. Okay, so that is somewhere near, I think, 19. So if I do the calculation, let me quickly do it for you. So 1900 के ऊपर है, based on some places, different जगहों के ऊपर you will see different rates, but that's somewhere close to 45,000 rupees, right? So we're on the lower end. India is almost reaching on the higher end. ठीक है, फिर उसके बाद अपर मिडिल इनकम के अंदर कौन आएगा? तो दिस इज लाइक योर सम मिडिल ईस्टर्न इकोनॉमीज हो सकती हैं. So if you're earning somewhere up to 2,90,000 rupees per person in your economy, now that's a very reasonable salary. Your kids can go to decent school and good entertainment. You can do vacation and stuff like that also. Reasonable within the country vacations and all. So that's a reasonable economy. This is your upper middle income. A lot of South American countries would be part of that. And then high income is obviously you're earning more than 290,000 and plus. So इसके अंदर अगर मैं just to give you an idea in dollar terms, like Scandinavian countries would be somewhere around 70. Singapore would be near 70,000 or $75,000 per person. So that's like almost like 9 lakh, 10 lakh, in fact, more than that per month. So obviously your living standard will be pretty decent. Now, this is an average for the country, right? So if you're living in like Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, obviously, usually people in these economies and especially इनके जो अच्छे elite areas हैं उसके अंदर people are earning 10,000, 15,000 plus per annum. So obviously their living standard is as close to almost like you could say एक बंदा जो अच्छा UAE के अंदर earnings होंगे, right? So they'll have much decent cars even after paying heavy duties, 4 times the price of the car, and they can afford stuff like that, right? So it depends country to country also, and within the country you can't just say कि on average पाकिस्तान का अगर 1900 है तो कराची लाहौर इस्लामाबाद के लोगों का भी 1900 होगा, right? It's just an average. um After that, let's go into the more details of this. अब हमारे पास आ जाता है एक इकोनॉमी के अंदर some countries that have low income per head. तो उनके साथ क्या होता है, there is a terminology that we want to talk about over here, which is poverty cycle. Okay, now poverty cycle is basically you don't have good development in your economy. So there are two cycles that we can discuss over here. That because you're a poor country, you have low incomes. So naturally, if your country has low incomes, that means pretty much people are spending all of their income, right? So that means you have low savings also. And if you have low savings, then obviously you have low investment. right? And if you have low investments, you're not able to get good machines and tools and stuff like that. तो obviously फिर आपकी इकोनॉमी में लो प्रोडक्टिविटी है. Low productivity leads to low incomes. Honestly, if we want कि किसी भी इकोनॉमी के अंदर अगर आप चाहते हैं कि हम उस मुल्क को तरक्की की तरफ लेके जाना चाहते हैं, so honestly, you don't have to fall into the jargons. It's all about productivity. If you're able to raise your country's productivity, the living standard will improve in the basic terms, right? Because productivity leads to more output in the given time or in the given resource. So naturally, per person, incomes will rise. So that is what our focus should be. दूसरा पॉवर्टी साइकिल हम क्या कह रहे हैं कि जब आपकी लो इनकम इकोनॉमी है तो नेचुरली देयर इज लो स्पेंडिंग टुवर्ड्स एजुकेशन एंड हेल्थ केयर. इट्स पुअर एजुकेशन स्टैंडर्ड, पुअर हेल्थ केयर, सो ऑब्वियसली योर ह्यूमन कैपिटल, you don't have a very good human capital. Your human resource is not so healthy and it's not so educated and skillful. So naturally, because आपके पास low levels of human capital है. If you remember, there's physical capital and there's human capital. So अगर low human capital है, that means less skilled resource human आपके पास है. So obviously low economic growth होगी because of low productivity, and then the cycle continues. So you can get trapped into these two cycles, and it's not going to be very favorable to you. All right, when we move forward, obviously GDP per head or GNI per head is one of the measures of living standard. But then we use other measures of living standards as well, because only when we're talking about GDP or output, we're talking about the incomes or the output that is produced. But we know that living standards or economic development is much more than just producing the outputs, right? So, like for example, over here they mentioned even like infant mortality rates and how many doctors per thousand of your population. These are these non-monetary terms which also sort of like have an impact on the living standards, right? So उसके लिए फिर because GDP or GNI per head is like a single indicator. So what we can also use is something called a composite indicators. Now, composite indicators basically takes the weight of multiple things which can be considered as part of the living standards in the economy. And then it takes a couple of things, it weights it up, and it gives a single number, which sort of like helps you identify the living standards beyond just what is being produced. One of the most common ones that you might have done in O levels also is something called Human Development Index, the HDI, right? So it's a United Nations index. It takes three things into account. One is obviously GNI per head, that means output per person using the country's resources domestically and internationally. तो एक तो ये composite हो जाता है, composite के अंदर one of the measures. The second is you look at the education. Again, that's an important one. Education, where you're taking two things into consideration. One is the expected years of schooling, and the second thing is the mean years of schooling. In दोनों चीजों में फर्क क्या है? Sort of the expected years of schooling is kind of like a projection that if a kid goes into school, how many years are they expected to complete? Okay, so it's a projection of, on average, a kid, how many years of schooling can they do while, everything else remains constant, the enrollment numbers and so on. Whereas the mean years of uh, schooling is sort of like what is the actual. So this is sort of like taking adults into consideration that in your economy, when you look at the adults based on the past data, how many years of schooling have they done? And projection is about when a kid enters into a school, how many years is expected. Now it's a projection. It does not take into account the number of dropouts and stuff. So, right, obviously there's going to be a difference. That expected years of schooling आपकी है कि बच्चा at least metric तो करेगा. We have reasonable schooling up until metric. Metric is somewhere around, I think, grade 10, 11, 11 is, right? But turns out that your actual adult को जब हम देखते हैं reality के अंदर, turns out the number is that you have on average 5 years of schooling kids have done because there's a very high dropout rate. Do you see that? So in HDI, you're also factoring in the expected years of schooling and the education wala element. And then uske baad, the next thing that you're taking into account is the healthcare, the life expectancy. A person, on average, how long are they expected to live? Obviously, 80 years in your economy, if people are life expectancy is around 80 years, I think Japan has a really high one. And then when you come towards developing economies, the average might be somewhere near 50, 60. So that's obviously a low life expectancy. And that talks to us about that how the medical services are in that economy. The poorer the economy, a low income economy would obviously have much lesser of all these things. And then the GNI number, basically the GNI number is from 0 to 1. No country is zero. Even like the worst African economy is not going to be zero. Okay. So your number is going to be between like 0 and 1. तो उसके अंदर फिर आप देखते हो कि 1 is amazing, like countries like Scandinavian countries and Australia and these countries would be near like 0.9 something, right? No country is at 1 exactly. तो इस तरीके से then we are sort of looking at it. Okay. Then moving forward, please remember that countries जब आप ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट इंडेक्स करते हो that will not always match the GNI. Some countries might have really good education and healthcare, but their GNI might not be that good, right? So there can be variations, okay, as long as 0 to 1 आप देख रहे हैं. So that's a good thing. उसके अलावा we have more indicators, right? We can talk about indicators like something called MEW. It's a measurable economic welfare. Now, it's an adjusted version of GDP, which basically aims to reflect the true economic well-being. Okay, so it has sort of like two kind of adjustments you do. You obviously have the GNI per head, GDP, sorry, per head, and then the positive adjustments you make on this is, there are a lot of things जिसको आप नॉन मार्केटेड एक्टिविटीज कहते हो. जैसे एक बंदा है वो शौकिया घर के अंदर गार्डनिंग करता है, राइट? सो या अपना घर का ख्याल करता है, लाइक हाउस वाइफ. नाउ they're not getting paid for something like this, but it is something that has an economic value, because if you were not doing it, you would have need to hire somebody to do that, right? So obviously you want to factor in those non-marketed activities that's called. Also, you would like to add leisure time. Now we know that in terms of the living standards, leisure time obviously contributes in the economic welfare. If you have like a long weekend coming up, you can go camping, you can go for vacation or take a small vacation or just travel or do something on the side that obviously improves your living standards. So GDP does not factor that in. GDP only looks at, okay, you work, you produce, you got the money, no matter how miserable it makes you. So leisure time improves that. साथ ही में you might even take something like the public services, जैसे कि healthcare or education कैसा है. You might want to factor that in also. These are some positive adjustments that you make. But then on the side, you have some negative adjustments that you do also. Like, for example, we know that when you have a high GDP, your resources get depleted and you pollute. Obviously, more output means more pollution. And that damages the environment. When you're going out, it's all pollutants, right? You can't breathe properly, like we have the case with Lahore or Delhi, right? So obviously that worsens people's living standards. Now, GDP does not factor that in. MEW does. So you want to take that, you want to take crime costs, you want to take into account the income inequality. So all of these basically are factored in. So measurable economic welfare tries to show a more accurate picture of people real quality of life, right? Not just the economic output. फिर उसके बाद recent essay के अंदर, honestly, I've never given this part much of an importance, but clearly it's an important thing as well. Something called, अभी ये essay के अंदर आया है recently, not our variant, but another variant. When we do the past paper questions and all, we're gonna talk about those. ठीक है? So इसके अंदर, the one that we have right now is something called the multi-dimensional poverty index. Okay. In this one, basically, it's an Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative and the United Nations Development Program. अक्सर तुम केस स्टडीज वगैरह में जो राइट अप होगा वहाँ नीचे सोर्स लिखा होगा UNDP, right? So it's obviously an important one. It's a credible organization. Basically, the multi-dimensional poverty index, yeah, MPI, is much more detailed. Okay, it takes more things into consideration. For example, it takes living standard. बल्कि in fact, जब आप ऐसे में लिख रहे हैं, तो you want to break it down into, okay, so there are some indicators. एक living standards है, education है, ठीक है, और health है. It's pretty much the similar thing. If you notice, it's a lot similar to your HDI. But what happens is that it sort of like talks about things much more in detail. So, for example, when you're looking at living standard, you're not just looking at GNI per head. You're looking into much more details. The details are that like cooking fuel ki availability, sanitation ki availability, drinking water, electricity, housing and assets. You're taking these things into consideration. Okay, so अब इसका जो indicator है, the sixth indicator. Okay, यहाँ पे हमारे पास जो एक दो तीन के अंदर हम और further details के अंदर जाएंगे. So the six indicators of living standards are given a total weight of 33%. The two indicators of education has 33%, and then 2%, two indicators of the healthcare is given 33%. So basically, this is what's going on, right? So what is going on in this is कि लिविंग स्टैंडर्ड्स के अंदर they've mentioned cooking fuel, sanitation, education and electricity and all of these, right? So वो ये कह रहे हैं कि इसमें से ये जो सिक्स इंडिकेटर्स हैं, एक दो तीन चार पाँच छः, ये सिक्स इंडिकेटर्स जो हैं, these are your standard indicators and collectively these indicators are given 33% of the total weightage. फिर उसके बाद जब हम एजुकेशन में आते हैं तो अगेन द इयर्स ऑफ स्कूलिंग एंड स्कूल अटेंडेंस, इन दो इंडिकेटर्स को 33% का वेटेज दिया है, वेरी हाई वेटेज टू एजुकेशन. फिर हेल्थ केयर के अंदर बेसिकली चाइल्ड मोर्टालिटी एंड nourishment, like how the food access to the health care of kids and adults, उसको इन दो इंडिकेटर्स को 33% दिया है. In the marking scheme, I have seen them writing, because you're writing an A2 का essay, so we need much more detail. So basically, not only that you identify कि living standards में कौन से 6 indicators हैं, education में और healthcare में कौन से दो indicators हैं, we also want to talk about the percentage that are given to them. Okay. And obviously, if they are getting, if there's malnutrition and they're not provided better stuff, so clearly जो है आपके numbers जो होंगे वो कम होंगे. Kids who are not attending school, these numbers will be on the lesser side. So clearly आपके numbers जो होंगे वो अच्छे नहीं होंगे. So the aim of MPI is to help countries understand why countries are poor and why some stay poor even when incomes are rising. You might have higher incomes, but you don't have access to these things. You will still be on the lower side. Your GNI might be on the lower side, but the state is providing with you these things, so your MPI will be much more better. So MPI can help governments and international organizations target the poorest countries, and then they can create or coordinate, plans to help these out in these particular way. Okay, so that is an important one for your essay. This entire paragraph is important. You should know that. फिर उसके बाद जब हम आगे और further जाते हैं, so we have this discussion of the Kuznets curve. Kuznets curve can also help us sort of understand what happens. It's a very interesting one, the Kuznets curve. Simon Kuznets basically came up with an idea, and he said, you know what, you've been talking about that when a country's GDP per head increases, more output, more income, improved living standards, right? But turns out that Simon Kuznets is proving an idea that when your country has a very low GDP per head, and when you're sort of increasing the GDP per head from a very low, like for example, if you take Afghanistan and they have a very low GDP per head, and if you increase their GDP per head, it can be other African economies also, or South Asian economies, or South American economies, which are really low on GDP per head. And if their GDP per head increases, notice here it talks about GNI coefficient. So as far as GNI coefficient goes, the closer you are to zero, a low number means uh, equality, okay? And a high number would mean inequality, right? So high number would represent inequality. So for example, if your GNI, which will never, it will never happen, but if your GNI reaches one, what that means is that in your country, one person has all the wealth of the nation, all right? And everybody else has nothing compared to. And if your number is zero or close to zero, that would signify that in your country, the income equality is amazing. You know, nobody is better off than the other. Everyone's almost equal, right? So if you look at Simon Kuznets' concept, he's saying when the country's GDP per head is low, you are at low, your equality is much more higher. People, pretty much everyone's poor, so everyone's living standard is the same. When GDP per head starts to increase, what happens is that inequality actually goes up until a particular GDP per head. Okay. So inequality actually goes up. So the idea over here is what happens is that when industrialization takes place, there are people who takes the risk and start the industrialization, and they set up businesses, and they're earning more money than the workers, right? There's only one boss, right, in an organization, or a couple of bosses, but they have plenty of workers, right? So obviously, those bosses, their income is going to rise much more as compared to the workers. So their living standards will improve, their kids' education will improve, their healthcare will be far more greater than the rest of the people. But once your GDP reaches a particular level, now we don't know what this level is, you can just guess. But once you reach a certain level, like let's say, once you reach like an upper middle, that is like we discussed, somewhere around, if you're making like $290,000, or even like 1 lakh dollar to like 150,000, not dollars, sorry, 150,000 rupees per month per person. That means that your household will be able to send kids to the decent school and decent healthcare and education and all. So income per head, sorry, the inequality will start to fall, equality will start to go up after that GDP per head level, right? So that's what Kuznets curve is about. And I think it's a very reasonable discussion. It is pretty logical also at the same time, right? Okay. उसके